Today we're talking coffee scales. It's a thing, it's a category now. I mean, just look at what I have in front of me here. I have 15 different scales built for making coffee, and yet in the comments there's going to be people telling me that I missed something really key or really obvious. There's almost too many to even review and pay attention to. And the prices, they vary a lot. Like the most expensive set of scales we have here costs 12.5 times more than the cheapest set here. And when you have a spread of price like that, well, why? Why is this so expensive? Why are these much more expensive than those? What do you get? What don't you get? And ultimately, does it even matter? Let's talk through what we've got. You'll notice my clothes are different. We realized these are all black. And holding them up and showing them to you while wearing a black sweatshirt, not compelling video. Anyway, let's start at the beginning price-wise with these. These are from Sage Appliances, Breville to the rest of the world. They do a little scale for £14.99, so I presume about $20 in the US. We have the MHW3 Bomber. These are the Cube Mini 2s, and these cost about £37. Highly requested when we put this out to Patreon. These are the Maestri House scales, and they are £40. Next up, Wakako, maker of various coffee brewers. They have the Exagram Pro scales for £44.90. For 10p more, you can get these, the Brewista scales. I think the Espresso Scale 2, and they are £45. Next up is the Normcore Pocket scales, £50. Here, a bit of a jump in price, £81 now. These are the Laybird Mag-Attach Precision scales. Here we have the latest from Hario. I think they were the first movers in this category, possibly maybe, with a coffee scale. These are the Polaris scales, and they are £85. For just a little bit more, at £87, you've got the Time More Black Mirror Nano scales. Next up, a bit heavier, I have to say, is the Buku Themis Ultra, and they are £100. From Decent Espresso, this is the Half Decent scale, and it is £105. Up at £119, these are the Varia Aku Mini scales. Smaller again is the Buku Themis Mini, they are £129. And then a big jump in size and price. This is Fellows Tally Pro scale. This is £185, about $200 I think in the US. And our most expensive scales in the test, the Akaya Luna scales. These are $250 US. Now there's a bit of discussion with the team here about making this particular video because I want to be clear about what this is not. I'm not trying to show you the latest fancy expensive thing to try and get you to spend more money and buy more stuff and just get stuck in the endless painful cycle of consumerism. That is not the goal here. I don't want to make this video to try and make you feel bad about what you've got or that you need to upgrade. I'm going to say now, if you own a set of scales, I'm not sure there's going to be anything super compelling that makes you upgrade. You may disagree at the end of this, and I'll be curious if you do, but this is not a look at the fancy toys, you need more toys, toys will make you happy, because they won't. What this is, though, is a look at what is going on in this category. It's one of those things alongside, I suppose, coffee grinders that have kind of exploded with loads of manufacturers jumping into the space, new brands, existing brands. There's just a lot happening here. Is it important? Does it matter? Does it? It's a good question, I think, a pretty important question, and we aim to answer that. Now, what we're going to do, first of all, we'll talk about how scales work in general, because what's going on in this is exactly the same in many ways as what's going on in this one here. Then we're going to talk about things like build quality, because that does matter. We use our coffee scales, we put them through their paces in a variety of different ways, and so build is really, really important. Then we want to get into just straight accuracy, because kind of important basic function of scales is that they tell you what something weighs accurately. And then we'll get into the UX UI stuff. Like, how is this to use, to own? Is the features here useful, frustrating, annoying? Have they done things that are kind of wild and weird? Have they done clever things? And then at the end, we'll talk about a few favorites that we have under different sort of scenarios. It might be for the espresso only enthusiast. There might be a different recommendation to the pure filter brewer. But let's start with how scales work. This is actually a set we're not talking about today because they seem to have disappeared from the internet. This is the Lamido Mini. It's about £38.50. Let's take a look inside. To be clear, this was just an excuse for some fun editing. This is not commentary on the build quality of this scale. Anyway, you've got your display, which has obviously got all of the board stuff on the back. So that's the sort of brain of this whole thing. We've got stuff like a USB-C port for charging, switch for turning stuff on, battery, in this case kind of glued in. And then this is the main event. This is the most important piece, I suppose. This is the bit that does the weighing of stuff. This is called a load cell. And every single one of those little scales will have a bit of metal in it just like this, with wires attached that will go to the board. And the way that load cells work is pretty simple. You pass a voltage across this sort of bit of metal, and as it distorts under load, you get variable resistance. And so if you can work out how to correlate the change in resistance across the metal due to its deformity to a particular weight, well, that's how a digital set of scales works, basically. It should be noted that things like temperature will impact these sort of things, which is one of the reasons most of the kind of coffee scales where stuff is hot have those little rubber mats that I don't really like on them, but that's part of that sort of deal. You don't want these to get hot because you'll get a different result from them for the same weight going onto them. The technology doesn't really change between a 15-pound set of scales and a 250-pound set of scales. They might do a better job of mounting or isolating it from variables and making sure that it is properly deforming under load from above and there's no weird, I suppose, cross-axis movement or that kind of stuff. Better thermal insulation maybe, but basically the weighing stuff, that's it. Just bend this. That's how it works. This is a little 100-gram precision calibration weight. It should weigh exactly 100 grams. You buy these to calibrate scales. We use this for a very boring but thorough accuracy test. If you put this on a scale, it should say exactly 100 grams. We did this 40 times for each scale, which is a lot of times. Did they all say exactly 100? Well, no. About half of them did. Say every single time they said 100.0 grams. Others occasionally would give us a slightly different reading. All of them do state, as manufacturers, there is a tolerance to their accuracy, and only one of them, I would say, is kind of out of that. These are the ones that didn't say 100 exactly every single time. But again, because they're in sort of tolerance, I don't want to talk about most of them because it doesn't really matter, with a couple of exceptions. One of them was the cheapest scale here, the Sage scale, but it has no calibration function, which is notable. So you can't calibrate them. Everything else has a calibration function baked into it, where you can use the 100-gram weight and be like, this is 100 grams. Okay. The only other one that was sort of similar in performance was the Barista scale. Just slightly more often did it read out by 0.1. The weird one is the Fellow Tally Pro. Most of the time, if you take a scale and you give it a 100-gram weight and you say, this is exactly 100 grams, when you put it on immediately afterwards, it will say 100 grams, 0.0. This didn't. This always said 100.2, like every time. Every single time, occasionally 100.3. So we contacted Fellow, and Fellow said, oh, that's weird. Let us send you a new scale. Cool, we thought we had a weird manufacturing defect somehow. So on this scale, which is the replacement, the same thing. Does it matter? Does it make a difference to how your coffee brews when you use a scale like this? I don't think it does. I just think it's really weird. We haven't had much follow-up to explain what's going on from Fellow on this one. We have asked. Bit odd. We do have to talk briefly about build quality. I will say broadly, the build quality is surprisingly good across all price points. There's a couple of ones I want to highlight where the build quality is kind of notable. Look. There's not really any shade on this. This is £15. It feels like the cheapest of all of them here. It's large, that's not a bad thing. It's got real buttons, but it doesn't feel remotely fancy. If you take something like the little Maestri house scales, £40, so not the most expensive thing here, but the fit, the finish, the look, the feel of it is surprisingly nice. It's quite heavy. On the build front, I will have to highlight the Barista. This is £45, so for £5 more than this thing here, the Maestri, it does feel substantially cheaper. This one looks to be poorly assembled. The sort of weighing plate is wonky. The buttons don't feel great. The whole thing, it just has a cheapness to it where for matching money, you get a nice fit and finish and weight to it. I can't help but sort of note that. All right, let's just weigh some stuff. The Maestri House. 283 grams. How does that compare to the much more expensive Akaya? 289 grams. That feels like, when I pick these up, that's a sort of smart coffee scale weight in my head. The Buku, 400. I'm going to call it 430 grams. 430 grams. That's substantially heavier, and I have no idea why. This isn't commentary, other than every time I pick this up, every single time I pick it up, my brain goes, hey, that's heavy. That's weirdly heavy. Is that satisfying? I don't know if it is. Now, as a little aside, a while ago, I made a video where we made espresso and we put stuff in a CT scanner. And when I was there, I put things like a dosing tray in a CT scanner. That was fun. But I also took 2 scales with me. One is the Lameda that we dropped and exploded for you. And then we also took the Akaya because I wanted to sort of see if you could use a CT scanner to understand what's going on in there. On the surface of it, the componentry looks basically the same. You've got the load cell, you can see that. You've got batteries, you've got displays, little boards in there. But you'll see that the display on the Akaya is clearly fancier. Like there's a lot more going on there. That's clearly a much nicer piece. Again, you can see what's contributing to the weight. There's kind of metal plates in these things. You can see what they're machined, made out of. It's just an interesting comparison, but I don't think it answers the question of why is this $250 compared to something that was barely $50. The next thing I want to talk about is the kind of responsiveness of the scales. That's going to be a couple of things. One, how quickly does the screen itself refresh? And then how quickly is the screen able to show you an accurate number for what it's weighing? Is there much lag in the system? We did 2 tests for this. Test 1. Using a high-speed camera, we shot at 120 frames per second and added a dose of coffee beans to the top of the scale. And then we recorded how long it took from the last bean being added and hitting the weigh pan until the screen showed an accurate weight of the beans. There's always going to be a bit of variance here, that the impact of the beans falling in, just like when you dose coffee, will sort of throw the weight off a little bit, and it'll take a minute to resolve. They're here for me in kind of order of responsiveness. For completeness, here's a brief table giving you a sort of millisecond count from that last bean hitting and landing and being still in the tray to it showing the sort of final weight reading. And you'll see there's a pretty big range of times here. Generally speaking, from this test, I would say most of the scales are completely fine and I have no real concerns about it. We should probably just talk about the bottom 3. One of those 3 is less good, and that was the Sage Breville scales here. The refresh rate is very slow. It just seems to take a long time to both calculate and then show the numbers, and refreshes them very, very slowly indeed. The 2 sort of odd ones out here were the Akaya and the Varia, both of which show to 0.01 of a gram. And wherever you have higher accuracy, you will expect it to take longer to get to that number because it's got to tune out a lot more noise in the signal. If you look at a proper lab balance that weighs to 0.01 of a gram, that'll typically have little shields and sliding doors around it so that movement of air doesn't affect your reading, because movement of air should and will affect a 0.01 gram accurate scale. Here, they're just trying to tune the noise out and kind of give their best, most accurate answer. That just takes longer. Generally speaking, a more rapid refresh rate doesn't equal more accuracy in terms of kind of calculated final number. With these scales, if you compare the speed of the Akaya at a 0.01 to 0.1, so 10 times less accurate, I suppose, it's much quicker when you ask it a simpler thing. And so that's why these 2 in the 0.01 gram mode did worse. Let's talk about the second test, which is slightly more real world, but open to a lot more human error. I had to pour, as accurately as I could, 100 grams of water onto each scale. So I set up a carafe, pouring kettle, poured at about pour over speed, and tried to hit 100 grams every single time. I then, for each scale, took multiple readings. I'm quite pleased with myself. My average across all scales, across all pours, was 101.47 grams. So you can, with a bit of practice, pour pretty accurately. There's a couple of scales I need to highlight in this. Once again, the Sage Breville scales here were really hard. I could not get close enough to 100 grams. I was usually 104, 105. Every time, it just didn't give me the information that allowed me to sort of do the calculation and stop that little bit early to hit the number that I wanted to hit. Often the scales with very, very high refresh rates were kind of useful in some ways because it looked like you'd hit 100 before you'd had, because you're still getting the impact of the water as well as the water itself. So you'd stop, and then it would be like, actually, you've got less than that now that we recalculate. That said, the 2 scales with very high refresh rates on the numbers are the Fellow and the Varia again. And the Varia refreshed in such a way that actually it was sort of dizzying to sort of use. It was too many numbers changing. Look, Just look at the size of it. It's clearly not made for pourovers. This is not particularly a fair test of it. And actually the fellow a little bit the same. You get a lot of refreshing going on. It can almost feel a little bit of overwhelm to the brain. But those kind of stood out as the worst performers. Everything else, what was interesting to me was that we're going to talk about beeps in a second. Everything else, even if my first pour was a little bit high, it was pretty easy to compensate. And so generally speaking, on a bunch of these, my first pour would be like 102, 103 grams. And then I kind of understand the lag pretty intuitively and then could hit 100 pretty easily afterwards. So on almost all of these, I don't really think responsiveness presents a significant challenge, with the exception ultimately of the Sage Breville here. It's the cheapest one. It's not really in the same ballpark as the rest of these things here. Now's the key moment, the moment you've all been waiting for, where we assess the beeps. 10 of our 15 scales will beep. You're going to hear this beep all the time unless you turn it off. A lot of them you can mute the beep, but if you like a beep, and in some cases, I think a beep is actually kind of useful because none of these here have tactile buttons. You don't know that you've pushed a button by feel. You would know it by beep or by the sort of action on the screen. We've gotten very good at making things like trackpads that don't actually move feel like they click. I'm just saying, a beep feels like an inelegant solution to the problem of, I don't know if I've touched a button or not. It's a delicate beep. I think in the app, which is already a red flag of a sentence, you can adjust the volume of the beeps on these things, but it's different to the same manufacturer's other scales. I quite like that beep. The time more. No, it's not a good beep. It's just a bit, it's up in your business. Just all of you. Stop. Oh no. Double beeps? Okay, so if you push the tear button, it says you've pushed the tear button and also have finished tearing. Great, but double beep. I believe they bought the same beep as this particular scale. It's not a great beep. The Maestri House. Oh, muted, softened. Still the double beep. Do you know, it feels like they've rolled off the top end. I'm actually not sure I like that. I feel like it feels like a sort of trapped inside something beep rather than a, hey, I'm here on the bench beep. Oh, worse, in fact. Hello? Hello? Is that the same beep? It's a popular beep, but it's not for me. Now I quite like, look, there's a bit more musicality to this beep. Well, it's lacks length. There's a bit, it feels very, I'm done. It's fine. It's a little cheap sounding, but it's not offensive. But I would expect for the money a more luxurious beep. Let's move on. On the UX UI front, there's one special case that these 7 sort of scales have that I want to talk about, because I have to talk about it because it's been a part of my experience, but it's really up to you if this is a relevant piece of this. All of these have 2 on-off switches. They all have a main on-off switch, which is a physical switch, and then an on-off button that's a tactile switch. Let's say you travel a lot with your coffee scales. You probably don't want them switching on in your bag. So actually having a sort of isolating off switch where the touchscreen stops working is a desirable thing for you. So if that's you, you might want one of these 7. In use here, where I'm sharing scales with other people, often I would walk up, there'd be a set of scales on the bench, I would push the tactile switch to turn it on, and ideally it turns on. But if it doesn't, then you're like, ugh, I've got to turn on the on switch. And then you got to turn on the on switch sometimes, and it is on. You just haven't done a good job of pushing the tactile switch and you didn't know. That's not a great experience. And part of me felt like, look, just make it an on-off thing, but people will forget to turn them off, won't they? You'll forget. You'll just walk away and the battery will go flat and you'd be mad about that. I suppose they'll drain less power in the fully off than standby mode, but I can't imagine it's significant in its difference. But it's just a weird little quirk and a choice that mixes tactile buttons with these sort of contact buttons that I just don't really enjoy. And it, for me, was often a frustrating part of the experience. For most people, you'll buy one set of scales, you'll know if you like to switch them on or off. But if you share your scales with someone, have an agreement. Because I promise you, it is surprisingly rage-inducing to turn on your scales and they don't switch on because the on button that you pressed is not the on button, it's just an on button that requires another on button to be on before you can push the on button. I think I've made my point. Now, this next point, I suppose you could say, is a similar theme because it may not really apply to you if you just have one set of scales and that's that. However, because some of these scales are kind of single use, like this is an espresso scale, this is an espresso scale, this is not an espresso scale, the fellow over here is too big, you're not going to put that on your drip tray. So you might have, potentially, you could end up with 2 different scales for 2 different styles of brewing. I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying you could. I need every scale manufacturer to get together and just have a standard, have an agreement, right? Like just agree on how things work. It would make life so much easier. On most of these scales, the on button also tears, so you know that's the thing. But not all scales. Buku are like, no, you turn it on the left, you tear on the right. Unacceptable. Everyone else has sort of set a precedent. Please just play along nicely. That said, most of the time, people use T for tear, but they don't always. Akai uses T for tear, but this scale uses T for time. Which is it? Can we just agree? Can we get rid of the letter T? Can we do something different? I don't mind what it is, but it is pretty maddening that there isn't a kind of standardized approach to this thing. How do I turn my scale off? That requires you read a manual because it's not always intuitive. You don't just push and hold an off button, but sometimes you do. You don't double tap the off button, but sometimes you do. It would be lovely from a consumer perspective if you could all get together, scale manufacturers, and just agree on how things work. And I'm not saying no one should have to read a manual ever, but I am saying if to use the very basic functions of a weighing scale, I need to read a manual, that's not success into the other bits and pieces of the UX UI experience with these things. Generally speaking, I would carve up sort of smartness into 2 things. There is Bluetooth connectivity. That, I would say, is useful if you are using a Bluetooth-enabled espresso machine that might stop your shot using the scale if it's able to connect to it via Bluetooth. That is increasingly common, and so that is a nice-to-have feature, Bluetooth connectivity, that some of these have, and we'll make sure that we list the ones that do on screen so you kind of know. Not essential, and I don't see a particularly massive use for these for most people with a pour-over or most kind of coffee brewing sort of scenarios. A lot of these brewers will have some sort of smart mode. I don't like it and I see no value in them whatsoever. Personally, I struggle to see the use in them. You'll have things like espresso mode where it'll start the timer running when it detects weight being added at a certain point. Or it'll auto tear if you do this, that, the other. I just don't need it making decisions for me about anything. Generally speaking, if I'm timing a shot of espresso, I would recommend starting when you hit the button on. And yes, there's times when that pre-infusion may be shorter or longer and you're experimenting, and so the number becomes less relevant as a point of comparison, but nonetheless, I just want to start from the moment water contacts coffee to the moment that water stops passing through the coffee bed. That is my timer function. That's what I'm trying to measure, generally speaking. So the espresso modes on these don't really work for me. Some of them will do things like calculate how much water you need for that much coffee. Again, you're probably going to use a recipe you found online or from your roaster, and you don't need the scale to do this. I don't need the functionality. I don't need to get trapped by accidentally pushing a button and ending up in a menu that I don't want to be in or a function I don't want to be in, then having to cycle through 2 or 3 modes that I never use to get back to the one setting that I do, which is either just the weight or the weight and the time. I really deeply believe that that's enough. I could see scenarios where there are certain scales here that you might want to use almost in a lab setting. If you brew a lot and you're tracking everything and you're trying to take a ton of measurements, as we do here sometimes, then things like being able to log or track the sort of brew as it happens, I can see a utility to that. But for most people, it's just not worth spending extra money on. And so if that's the justification of why a scale might be £90 instead of £40, I don't think it's £50 well spent. I think you could spend that on coffee or something else and have a nicer time, a more enjoyable time, a more delicious time. Now, if you strongly disagree with me, if you're using those features all the time, like part of your daily brewing, I want to hear from you. Which features are you using? Which modes are you using? If you're using a connected espresso machine, that's sort of separate. I'm curious if you're out there. But if you're using some of the sort of smarter brew modes that these things have, how is that useful to you? Or if you've never used them, also let me know. That would be interesting too. I've talked quite a lot about buttons, and I do just want to shout out that 3 of these did have physical buttons. And it's sort of frustrating to me that two of them just feel very cheap. The Sage Breville is very cheap. It's £15. Like the buttons, it's not. That feels cheap. The Brewista, the construction, the build, and all of this, the buttons also feel pretty cheap. I will say, shout out to Fellow on this one. I do like the buttons. They work well. The little dial works better than the dial on like the Aiden. It has real physical buttons, and I like that. I think it's much nicer to use. I really like tactile feedback in there. It's a shame that it's a single-use scale from that point of view. And as you look at these, there's only really a few that sit as kind of hybrids between the two. There's a lot of little scales, and then there's a few medium scales, and then these larger scales that would just be inappropriate for espresso. There is no good, it seems, espresso scale with tactile buttons. Now, you would argue that tactile buttons might be a water ingress point, like a weakness there. That surely must have been solved at this point. Like having a waterproof button, there's lots of things that have waterproof buttons. A lot of these scales, because they're capacitive touch, can be triggered by liquid, say the spray from a channel in a naked portafilter. Now, things like the Buku do have a function where it's like, there's a sort of switch, which is sort of ignore accidental presses, where it shouldn't sort of be triggered the same way. That's a nice touch, but again, requires you use an app, which is always a downside to me. If you have to use an app to access a feature, it's a half point at most. It's not a full point. You don't get the full point. You'd think, looking at the smorgasbord of scales, someone would have done that, but no one's done that. Everyone's gone capacitive touch, and I've said what I have to say about that. Now, having talked single use, I do want to just touch on the Laybirds here, because again, they have this solution where you have a plate, which if you remove it, this is a perfect little espresso scale. Fits very nicely, pretty responsive, works well enough. And then if you want to make a pour over, this goes on top. Just click on there. Doesn't always line up perfectly, and that bothers me slightly. The real failing of this is that once it's on, the scale is the main way you would want to pick it up to move it. But this comes off quite easily. And so you forget all the time. And you just, oh, that's annoying. And then you're like, well, okay. And then, annoying. Like, just for me, again, I would have liked like a twist and lock, something like that, where it's physically locked on. That would be much nicer. How do I feel about most of these having integrated whey pans, where basically, I mean, the button is part of the whey pan. And so if you spill liquid on the button or you touch things or whatever else, you are hitting the load cell. Whereas this, obviously the buttons are separate. Here, 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 potentially here, but not always here actually. There's some separation of the whey pan from the controls. I think I like that. I don't like seeing the numbers change because I pushed a button. That's just me. In summary, well, what's the verdict here? What are the recommendations? Good question. I'm not going to go through each unit and give it a score or a ranking or those kind of things, because frankly, it doesn't really make any sense. It's not that useful. There's not many of these that I wouldn't strongly recommend. Like, I'm a bit frustrated by this. I probably really wouldn't recommend this at all. And then we have to talk about the really expensive ones separately, because the price tag changes the conversation. In the, I suppose, £35 to, say, £100 range, it's going to be about what's your utility here? What are you using it for? Do you need a single use set of scales? In which case, you know, I would make sure it just fits the drip tray, is robust, reliable, has good support, is fairly priced. But I wouldn't worry about features or accuracy, because they're not really differentiating in a meaningful way. This, I can't yet recommend the Laybird, because the sort of detaching tray is just a bit too frustrating for me. But I'm generally quite impressed by the cheaper end of the sort of scales here. I'd be comfortable brewing a pour over on the Maestri House, which is about £40. And the sort of MH3 Bomber, the Timor is great. Like a bunch of these, I have no hesitance recommending whatsoever. On the high end of things, oh, it's complicated. Akaya, let's just call it, you know, these are outrageously expensive. At $250, that's a pretty good espresso grinder. That's a pretty good filter coffee grinder. That's like pretty much a Bambino, like a Sage Bambino, a Breville Bambino, whatever. You're into like functional espresso machine territory for a set of weighing scales. I think that's very, very hard to justify unless somehow you're at a point in life where $250 is not a meaningful amount of money to you, which is a strange place to be. I can't say that I see the value in spending that much money on these from a performance perspective. I get it, they're very nice. I don't need the smart features. I wish they would make, if they built this with just less smartness for like 150 and they felt robust and reliable, that would be very interesting. $150. Still incredibly expensive, but you feel like you were buying a premium thing. And again, fellow at $200 US, oh, that's a lot of money again for a single use scale. I can't use this for espresso. Maybe I can wear a portafilter, but I can't use it under my espresso machine. It feels the closest to a kitchen scale of all of these here. And actually, if you bake a lot, if you cook a lot where you need some level of precision to 0.1 of a gram in your recipes, and you like the fancy thing, I guess this is like a very fancy kitchen scale that has a little bit of coffeeness built into it, but you don't need the coffeeness. You just don't need the coffeeness. The buttons are nice, but they're not $200 nice. Ultimately, my final thought is there's a huge amount of innovation kind of going on in scales. There's loads of people entering the market doing different things. Unfortunately for me, not enough of them are truly useful or deserving of more of your money. I like what Buku are doing by making these fully waterproof. That's worthwhile. But more modes, more automation in there, I don't really see it. And these days, I don't think you should have to pay that much for Bluetooth connectivity. Everything is Bluetooth now. The components can't be that much money. The code can't be that much time and development work. Maybe it is. If it is, feel free to yell at me in the comments down below. You can get a pretty great scale for not very much money. And I can't, unless you're in one of a few edge cases, recommend spending much more, because I don't think you get that much more for your money. It's an interesting world. I'm kind of glad to have done the testing, but for most people, the reassurance is you're not missing out if you're not spending crazy money on a set of scales. You're really, really not. But now I want to hear from you down in the comments below. Do you have one of these sets of scales? Has it had a significant impact if you've upgraded recently? Has there been a function, something it does that's really made a difference to you? I want to hear from you down in those comments below. If you've bought something on the cheaper end of things and you're happy with them, again, I'd love to hear from you. What's been your bargain find out there? I know that there have been scales released that we don't have here, but hopefully you have some way of assessing whether they are applicable or useful to you. But honestly, if you haven't spent crazy money, you're just not missing out. Anyway, that's it from me. I want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.